Hi everyone, Azo here and welcome back to the second part of the Smith-Morra Gambit repertoire. If you haven't seen the first part yet, I'll leave a link to that in the video description if you want to check it out. There I covered some basic tactical ideas as well as how to meet players who decline the gambit. And in this second part, the format is going to be very similar. We're not going to bother ourselves with tons of variations, but instead just take a look at key ideas and moves. The difference is, this time we will be looking at quote-unquote brilliant moves. We're talking unexpected piece sacrifices and subtle maneuvers to add more firepower. And they may be hard to spot, but once you break down the underlying concepts behind the moves, you'll be able to find them and execute them in your own games. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So we have the Smith-Morra accepted, and in this line, you may recall that b5 cannot be played because of bishop takes f7, followed by queen d5 with a fork. And so black has to play e6, and while it is a strong move, e6 does not solve every problem for black. Let's suppose, with e6 and a6, black continues in the style of a Khan or Paulsen Sicilian, and goes b5 and queen c7. Already white has a fantastic resource, knight to d5. And this is the first key move of the video to remember, because this is a highly recurring theme in the Smith-Morra Gambit, and for good reason. Knight d5 serves many purposes. It attacks b6 and c7, it opens the c file quickly, and if black decides to get rid of it with e takes d5, he weakens himself on two lines. In some cases, the e file opens very quickly, and black's uncastled king will struggle to survive. Or, in this case, the a2 g8 diagonal is weakened, with the e6 pawn no longer around to stop the fork of checkmate and a rook. And black doesn't even have any great alternatives to capturing the knight. If queen to d8, we'll go bishop e3 to threaten bishop b6 and knight c7, reminding black that the knight is still taboo thanks to queen takes d5. If queen to b7, we can castle and look to quickly activate our pieces by bringing our bishop to f4 and the rook to c1. And if black takes our knight, we can play on in true gambit style by wasting no time to develop. Or, you could go bishop takes d5 with a skewer, and if knight to c6, we have knight to e5, and black is hard pressed to defend f7. If knight h6, there's always bishop h6. So, going back, queen c7 was clearly played too soon. So let's consider bishop b7, which actually happened in one of my games. The threat is b4 followed by bishop takes e4, so I played queen e2 first. And black renewed the threat with knight to f6. Here I could defend with a3, but that seemed a little too slow for a gambit line. So I castled, and sure enough, b4 was played. And yet again, despite the pawn on e6, we can see the same idea in action, knight to d5. The threat is to go bishop g5, cripple black's pawn structure, and deprive the black king of a safe home. And if bishop e7 is played, white will be more than happy to take the bishop and win on the dark squares. So the most critical line is accepting the white knight, given that white doesn't have the queen takes d5 fork idea. However, instead of the diagonal, white is looking to exploit the e file. If bishop to e7, white will win the piece back and abuse the e file. But what if the queen blocks instead? Pause the video if you'd like more time to find the best move for white. The answer is rook to e1. We don't mind the queen trade. Similar to what we discussed in the previous video, white's pieces are often too active, and so the initiative doesn't stop just because the queens are off. If black wants to keep the piece, he can't play bishop e7 and allow d6, so king to d8, but then our knight jumps into action immediately. The threat is knight takes f7 for fork, so black has to move the rook, but we take on f7 anyway. And if king to c8, rook to c2 wins a piece by force, so king c7, and we can chase black's king all the way to a5. And we'd love to play rook c5, but there's a bishop on f8, so we shut it down with d6. Black can still try to stop rook c5 with knight to e4, but now our knight participates in the attack, and then we can take away the king's escape square of a4, and there's no good answer to the threat of rook takes c6, followed by knight b7 checkmate. And if en passant, the a file opens up, the lone king is no match for all the pieces. So that was one example of knight d5 in action, and I want to show you another taken from a game between Milan Matulovic and Brad Verovich Alexander. And it shows that Smith-Morra games don't always have to be a do or die in 15 moves. In fact, here knight d5 was played just to trade knights and force this pawn to the c file, and the openness of the position and the presence of several targets was more than enough compensation for white's pawn deficit. Matulovic went on to win his first pawn while retaining his activity, and that was enough to win a second pawn, the a pawn, and eventually, with some good technique, he managed to convert the game, and here black resigned because there's no stopping these connected passes. So that was about knight d5. Now I'd like to introduce another similar thematic brilliant move. Here in this position, white's rook is already on the c file, black's queen is on c7, and he has erroneously traded off his c6 knight. For these reasons, it may look like our knight is poised for d5. However, there is a stronger move here. Pause the video if you'd like to try and find it. The move is knight to b5, and it is in some way the cousin of knight d5. It's a pretty common move in the Smith-Morra Gambit, and for similar reasons to knight d5. It opens up the c file quickly and threatens knight to c7. The key difference is that knight b5 aims to get rid of the a pawn, whereas knight d5 aims to eliminate the e pawn. And in this case, the former choice, taking the a pawn, makes a lot more sense. First of all, if he takes on b5, we already win the b5 square, our bishop can take with check, and black will lose the queen. And even if the knight is not taken, we'll go knight c7 anyway to misplace the king and take the exchange. And if the knight is taken now, then the queen will be lost. So let's say black is a little wiser and decides to keep the knight blocking the c file and instead moves the queen. Black is not out of trouble yet. In fact, here we can use an idea covered in the last video, e5. After the position opens up, black's only move is queen to a7, and here, even though the queen is off of the c file, we still can play knight to b5. The idea is straightforward. We are threatening a7 and c7, and if the knight is captured, we successfully take advantage of black's king position before he castles. And now black has 3 legal moves, all of which are losing. If knight to d7, we'll take on g7 first, then remove the defender of the knight, and take on d7. And thanks to the g7 bishop, black's king is forced towards the center, where he'll be mated shortly. Bishop d7 is very similar. We'll sack the exchange and pave the way for bishop takes g7, and then take on d7. And again, f8 is covered, so black's king is forced towards the center. We'll give a check on b5 to stop the king from running to e8, and with 3 active white pieces attacking, mate will follow shortly. The toughest defense is king f8, but it's not enough to hold. We'll go rook to c7 to threaten rook takes e7 followed by bishop d6 check. And black actually has no good way of defending e7. If knight to g8, still rook takes e7, and taking with the king defeats the purpose of knight to g8, while knight takes e7 allows mate in 1. So the next best option is to anticipate bishop d6 and defend that square with queen to b6. But simply queen to c4 and black's light square bishop is lost. If bishop to d7, we'll first take on f6, threatening to take on e7 with check. And after black takes our bishop, we'll go rook d takes d7, and with white equalizing materially while maintaining a significant lead in activity, black can already resign here. Now for the last idea for this video, I'll present a game by the creative attacking genius Mikhail Tal. He played the Smith-Morra Gambit in this game and followed the typical development scheme. The opponent got his queen off the d file and proceeded with knight e5. And this move knight to e5 is actually a little bit too early, which we now know thanks to modern analysis. The refutation is to take on e5 with the knight and proceed with an idea that we are somewhat familiar with, bishop to b5. And it can't be taken because of knight takes b5. And now we see the advantage of having taken on e5 with the knight rather than with the bishop. With our bishop still on f4, black's queen still needs to keep an eye on e5 or his position will fall apart. So queen b8 is the only move, and here we can already force knight c7 with queen to c4. The reason this somewhat strange move is preferred over rook a to c1 is that if black takes our bishop, knight c7 will not just win an exchange, but the queen. If the black king runs, we have queen c5 mate. But instead of that, Tal went for bishop b3, then rook a to c1. And now we arrive at the crux of the game. White's position appears maximized. He has completed his development, but there are no tactics here. So what is white to do? Pause your video if you like more time to find a continuation. Tal played knight to d4. Why? There's still one attacker not working yet, and that is the f-pawn. So Tal simply wanted to clear the way and allow f4, which gains a lot of space. Black tried to fight back with e5, but that was a huge mistake because it gives up the f5 square and gives the b3 bishop good prospects on the diagonal. Black played rook to e8, and Tal made use of the weakened diagonal and the newly weakened f7 square with queen to c4. And his opponent tried to decongest the position with d5, bishop c5, and rook e6 to defend f6, but it is too little, too late. Tal found a neat trick here, and again, if you'd like, you can pause the video to find it. The move he played was queen takes c5, reminding black of his back rank issues. Knight takes c5 can be met with knight to f6, and it doesn't even matter if the g-pawn takes back, because the f5 knight covers the g7 flight square. And so there comes check and mate. So his opponent took on d5, but simply rook takes d5, and nothing has changed. And here black can barely move. It's hard to suggest a move for black, and he decided to take a pawn and hit the bishop with e takes f4. But then Tal ended the game with knight to e7. If king to h8, white has bishop takes f4, reminding the queen that she is overloaded. Queen takes f4 can be met with a queen sacrifice, and because the king is on h8, knight f8 doesn't save the game. And so, black played king to f8, but this walks into a discovered attack. Tal simply got rid of the attacker of the queen, and then took the rook, and here black resigned because of the material deficit and the threat of this discovered attack to win the queen. So, to sum it up, the three new ideas you have in your arsenal when playing the Smith-Morra Gambit is first of all, knight to d5, which attacks a bunch of important squares in black's turf, opens the c file quickly, and can soften the a2 g8 diagonal as well as the e file. The second idea is very similar. Knight to b5 or bishop to b5. They open up the c file very quickly. They threaten c7 or the uncastled king. But the differences compared to knight d5 are that a bishop giving check on b5 can mark the start of a brutal attack. And on top of that, b5 is often weaker with only one defender, the a6 pawn, whereas d5 can have as many as 3 defenders. And the last idea, if you think that your pieces cannot improve any further, you can pave the way for an f4 pawn break. And that's all for this video. There will be a part 3 where I'll talk about how we decide where to put our dark square bishop. The placement of every piece is pretty clear, like the light square bishop belongs to c4, the queen to e2, the rooks on c1 and d1, but only the dark square bishop has an important choice to make, whether he belongs on e3, f4 or g5. And so that's what we'll be looking at. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.